Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Biekert, and I am Vice President of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or CJPME. To those of you in the webinar and watching on Facebook Live, I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's webinar, which is entitled Women from Gaza Tell the Story of the Nakba, a conversation with Dr. Ghada Ageel. Tonight's event will give us the opportunity to hear from Dr. Ageel, who will talk to us about her edited book, A White Lie, which chronicles the story of Madiha Fahez al-Bata from Gaza. This is the first volume in a series of 6 entitled Women's Voices from Gaza from the University of Alberta Press. Interviewing Dr. Ageel would be CJPME board member Azeezah Kanji, who I'll be introducing a little bit later. Our event will be split into 2 parts. During the first part of the webinar, Azeezah will interview Dr. Ageel to help us understand the origins, vision, and stories of her book. Then, during the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together, we'll take moderated questions from the audience. At any time during the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do so, just type your question into Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. As time allows, the presenters will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A. Dr. Ageel's book, which I have right here, is indeed a very compelling read, and it's available at the University of Alberta Press. Dr. Ageel's publisher, Kathleen Kurks, will be putting into the chat details right now for how you can find the book, including a code to get 20% off. We are honored to have Dr. Ageel with us tonight. As we say with all of our guest speakers, the views and opinions of Dr. Ageel are her own and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of CJPME. To begin our event, I'll invite Tom Woodley, President of CJPME, for a brief word of welcome and to briefly introduce our organization. Tom?
Yes, well, good evening. Thank you, Michael. I'm really excited to be here and be part of this webinar. This is the first webinar actually that CJPME has done, so we're thrilled, and thanks to Michael for setting all this up and working with Ghada and her publisher and our board member Azeezah. And I think we're going to have a great evening, and hats off to Michael and all the rest of the participants, of course, who you will meet in just a moment. CJPME's mission is to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East, and I think this event fulfills that mission very thoroughly. We'll hear stories that are quite often, of course, overlooked and misunderstood and ignored. And it's just exciting to be able to highlight the stories of women from Gaza and the stories of, the stories of prominent and sophisticated speakers like our main guest, Ghada, here tonight. So thanks everyone for joining us. You will be hearing from us in the coming weeks and months about other exciting webinars, but thanks for joining us here tonight and enjoy the rest of the evening. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. And now it's my honor to introduce tonight's speakers. Our main speaker tonight is Dr. Ghada Ageel, co-author of A White Lie. She is visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta and a columnist for the Middle East Eye, London. She holds a PhD and MA in Middle East politics from the University of Exeter and a BA in education from the Islamic University of Gaza. Dr. Ageel is the recipient of several awards and scholarships, including the Phillips Grant and the Jerusalem Studies Scholarship of the University of Exeter. A third-generation Palestinian refugee, Dr. Ageel was born and raised in Khan Yunis refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Ghada's grandparents and parents were born in Palestine and later expelled from their homes in 1948 when the State of Israel was established. Dr. Ageel will be interviewed by Azeezah Kanji, a legal academic and journalist whose work focuses on issues related to racism, law, the war on terror, and social justice. She received her Juris Doctor from University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. Azeezah Kanji serves as Director of Programming at Newark Cultural Center, an Islamic educational, religious, and cultural institution in Toronto. Her writing appears regularly in Canadian and international media, as well as academic journals and anthologies. She also serves on the board of CJPME. Finally, and let me just put on my screen here. So finally, I'd like to say a word of introduction about Madiha Hafez al-Bata, whose story is chronicled in by Dr. Ageel in the book A White Lie, as I showed earlier. So Madiha was a Palestinian woman who was born in 1924 and raised in Khan Yunis in the south of the Gaza Strip. Her father was a teacher employed by the British Mandate Administration, and this job gave them the means to purchase a dunam of land in Khan Yunis and to travel across the region, including to Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria. She was a teacher and later headmistress, and in 1948, she used this position to advocate for education for refugee children. This is prior to the establishment of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees. She later joined the leadership of the Palestinian Women's Union and promoted women's participation in the Palestinian cause. She married in 1949 to a lawyer who later became mayor of Khan Yunis and became a member of the Palestine Liberation Organization's executive committee. His work brought the both of them to international conferences, including Cairo in 1961, where they met Egyptian President Abdel Nasser. In 1956, while she was on holiday in Egypt, Israeli forces attacked and occupied the Gaza Strip, massacring about 1,500 civilians in her own village, including several members of her family. She was forced to live in exile for 6 months until Israeli forces withdrew. Over her life, she lived through many periods of war, of occupation and struggle. And as the book notes, her life journey corresponds to and communicates the collective Palestinian story. She passed away at the age of 87 in 2011. There's much more to be said about her life. It's very rich, as explained in the book, but I'll let Ghada explain that in more detail. So without further ado, I'll let Azeezah Kanji take it away and start the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. It is my honor to be moderating this conversation with Professor Ghada Ageel tonight. And thank you to all of you for joining us in this virtual space for this conversation about the resilience, the resistance, and the liberation of Palestinian women. Yesterday, many of us marked Family Day, and the day before that was Valentine's Day, and we continue our celebration of love with this event tonight to honor and mark the decolonial love of Palestinian women who carry their families, their communities, their people, and their homes on their backs, in their arms, and in their hearts. I want to begin by reminding us all that we are having this conversation about colonial violence on land that is also colonized. I am speaking to you from Toronto, which is the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which was an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas to share and protect the land. And we know that as we are talking about the sharp edges of colonial violence experienced by Palestinian women, that Indigenous land, water, climate, and ecology defenders all across this land that now calls itself Canada are also experiencing the sharp edges of the state violence of criminalization, surveillance, and subjugation. And so we also send them our solidarity and our salutations. From Canada to Kashmir, from East Turkestan to Palestine, we know that the central logic of all settler colonial projects is the logic of erasure, the erasure of people, the erasure of place, the erasure of histories, the erasure of stories. And so I want to begin our conversation, Professor Ageel, by talking about the importance of remembrance and of storytelling, and particularly the storytelling of women and the storytelling of narratives of normal life, of ordinary life, of life preceding colonization and continuing to flourish after colonization. Can you talk a bit about the importance of these projects of remembrance and storytelling as acts of resistance and reclamation against colonialism?
Well, first of all, thank you, Azeezah, for the introduction and for moderating this event. And thank you for Canadian for Justice and Peace and Middle East for organizing this event and to discuss the first of this series that talks about women voices from Palestine and from Gaza, starting with the White Lie with Madiha al-Batta. Very important question, Aziza, to talk about the role of memory as an act and site of resistance to protest policies of erasure and policies of elimination, and a tool to be added to the arsenal of the marginalized people, the disfranchised group, including women, but as you said, including all the indigenous people, the native people, people who live under settler colonial regime or colonization. So in the context of Palestine, memory is very crucial. It's really have a high significance in the life of Palestinian to push back against the erasure of their history, the erasure of their traces, the erasure or elimination of their memory, and particularly that of the Nakba. And here, when I say Nakba, I am referring to the catastrophe that struck the Palestinian society and led to its destruction in 1948, when the ethnic cleansing occurred, when around, I would say, 90% or 80% of the Palestinian population has been expelled from their homes and land, and their society has been destroyed, and in the ruins of their homes and land, another state has been established. So in this context, it's become so important, the memory, to remember the homeland and to push back against these policies of erasure, the systematic policies that Ilan Pape, the Israeli new historian, called the memoricide, which means the attempted annihilation of the memory by erasing a history of one people, in this case the Palestinian, in order to write or rewrite a history of another people. And it's not a secret. I mean, neither in academia or even in the political statement by Israeli political leaders. Here, I remember the quote that I wrote in the book of Moshe Dayan in 1969, when he said, we have to remember, we should not forget that we came to a land that is not empty. It has been, inhabited by people. And in order to establish a new Hebrew, Jewish state, this has to involve erasure, a systematic erasure, renaming places, renaming villages. So based on such thing, I mean, he said, by the time no one would remember that there has been Palestine here, or towns or traces of the people. And I don't blame people, because there is nothing in geography books, there is nothing in history books. In addition, the places itself, these villages and towns, are no more on roadmap. And here the role of women become very crucial to step in to fill this denial, or to fill this gap. I mean, remember, as I am a person who lived under occupation, born and raised in refugee camp. I have been denied to study my history. It has been forbidden to mention anything about your homeland. So women, including my grandmother, who is another narrator of this series, stepped to fill this gap, to tell us the history of our homeland. So oral history has been handed from generation to generation, handing deeds of land, stories, tradition, keys of the homes, papers. When, for example, I am now today putting the thawb, the Palestinian dress of my village, Beit Daras. When I put this thawb, everyone would know me. I come from Beit Daras. So yes, Michael has introduced me, Ghada Ageel, the academic, the writer, whatever. But I am, after all and above everything else, is a Badrasawi. I identify myself, I define myself as a third generation Palestinian refugee who has ancestors and my grandparents and parents born in Palestine, expelled, and then we ended in the refugee camps, and we earned this title of being a refugee. So women step to fill this gap. And I am happy to say that I mean, despite this sad story, that this generation of women, those who witnessed the Nakba, those who, remember what was Palestine once upon a time, stepped in and, made sure that the story of our homeland not exiled from the memory. Yes, it is no more exists on the map. It no more exists even in the human history, because this has been exclusion, denial of international discourse because of this systematic policies of erasure. But she made sure that while she cannot return Beit Daras to the map at the moment, she cannot return the dead, the martyrs who, paid their life to defend Beit Daras. She wanted to make sure that Beit Daras is not exiled from the memory of the people and the memory of us, the Palestinian. And this is why, Aziza, if you ask any small kid in the camps in the occupied territories or in the shatat, in the exile outside Palestine, where are you from? They wouldn't say, I am from Kuwait, or I am from Jenin, or I am from this. I am from Sawafir village. I am from Jaffa. I am from Haifa. I am from Beit Daras. I am from Asqalan. So this, hold to the memory become around that event that called the Nakba, the catastrophe, that is very significant because not only it unified the Palestinian people and preserve their history, but also, and let me end by that, by motivating them to to preserve this history, and at the same time to lead a life and struggle for dignity, for freedom, for rights, and for better future for themselves and their families.
Inshallah. Professor Ageel, you mentioned your grandmother when you were speaking, and how she is one of the women whose narratives will feature in one of the later books in the series. Can you tell us a bit about the tapestry of women's narratives that comprise this series, and how Mediha Hafiz al-Batta's particular story fits as one thread within that tapestry?
Yeah, sure. In fact, when we started this project, we selected 7 women who represent, let's say, the Palestinian society at large in the Gaza Strip. So we picked 3 refugees, one from the north of Gaza, one from the middle of Gaza, and one from the south of Gaza. And why 3 refugees? Because they are the majority of the Gaza Strip are refugees. You talk about 75%, so around 1.5 million out of the 2 million inhabitants of Gaza these days. And we picked the indigenous person, Mediha, and I will be talking about her in a bit. The lady or the people who have been in Gaza before we, the refugees, or the influx of the refugees ended in the Gaza Strip. And then the 5th character was the Christian Palestinian, because many people think all Palestinians are Muslims. In fact, while it's the majority are Muslims, until the beginning of the 20th century, 8% of the Palestinian population were Christian. They were part and parcel and still from the Palestinian fabric and the Palestinian society. And the 6th was a villager, because a villager represents this attachment to the land, and what does it mean for her to be, exiled in her home or land to be confiscated. And the 7th character has been the returnee, the people who lived in Shatat in the exile because of policies of Israel and the occupation not allowing them to get back, and then they returned after Oslo agreement, and they are part and parcel. In fact, 2/3 of the Palestinian outside their country. I mean, there are 13 million, probably 4 million live inside and about 5. So the majority of the Palestinians are in the Shatat, are in the exile. So these were the 7 women, from urban and as well as countryside, from south and north, from refugee and non-refugee, tried to give a good representation of the Palestinian society. Your question, why Mediha was selected to be first? In fact, because Mediha, the story, I would say, correspond to and communicate the story of all these women, whether the villager, the refugee, the mother of prisoners, the returnee, the Christian, and also it unify, and I would say convey the collective Palestinian story at large, which is unfortunately full of sadness, because occupation, destruction, colonization, dispossession, apartheid. But at the same time, when you look and read the story, it's also a story that is, having, yes, sad scenes of loss, but also it's a story of a pride, of resistance, of happiness, of persistence, of pushing and against all the odds that women live in Palestine because of the occupation. So if we want to think about Madiha, she was the indigenous person who was born in Khan Younis, which is a southern village or town in the Gaza Strip. And in 1947, after the partition of Palestine, 1948, the destruction of Palestine, she opened her arms wide to these, hundreds of thousands of refugees who ended in Gaza. Can you imagine, Azeezah, at that point of time, the population of Gaza were around 70 to 80,000 people, and the refugees number were 200,000 people. So 3 times the number of Gazans at that point of time. And Gaza civil society dealt with these people, welcomed them, helped them. And now when we talk about the refugees and influx of refugees in the 21st century, and countries saying we cannot accommodate, this is the share, and you just look how people, ordinary people, doing, and this is in the mid of the 20th century, not the states, it's just normal people. So Madiha herself was part of, let's say, the people who received us, my grandparents and my parents who were young. And then Madiha herself, the time or the story would tell us she would love one of those refugees. She would marry one of those refugees, Ibrahim Abu Sitta, who has been expelled from the village of Lim'in Abu Sitta, which is not far from Khan Younis. And suddenly these dignified landowners, farmers, Bedouin, become homeless, become, looking for a place, looking sometimes in the garbage in order to get any wood to make a fire, because everything is gone. You talk especially about the husband of Madiha. 55,000 donum has been gone and denied access to them. So Madiha lived such a issue. And then later on, Madiha herself would taste what does it mean to be a refugee? What does it mean to be exiled? Because in 1956, as the story tells, Madiha would be in Egypt when France, Britain, and Israel attacked Egypt and occupied the Gaza Strip in the crisis of the Suez Canal. And she will receive later on the tragedy, the horrific news that 2 of her brother, a teenager, Nadid and Hassan, will be slaughtered in Khan Younis. And so she lives this bitterness, this I would say this tragedy. And when I think about her and this tragedy, it approximates millions of refugees, of Palestinians living this, I would say, every year when there is attack on Gaza or in West Bank, and you have a loved person who has been killed or jailed or injured or disabled because of the military occupation. So Madiha lived through that. She lived during the 1970, when it happened to be in Jordan, during the Black September, when the Jordanian government attacked the Palestinian resistance, and her brother-in-law would go missing, and then to discover that he was murdered by the Jordanian at that point of time. So Madiha, really, her story approximate and reflect the collective Palestinian story of people living under occupation and settler colonial regime. Not to mention that Madiha, as a mother, to have children under occupation, raise them in this dangerous atmosphere when there's arrest and there is deportation. And later on the story will tell us that her husband has been deported, imprisoned, interrogated. She has been separated. I mean, she has been made to make the very difficult decision to separate from her children, to send them to study outside so they won't end in the Israeli jails. And this is a privileged woman. She has the possibilities or the means to send her children. But nowadays in Gaza, no one could do that. Even if you are the brightest students, get the best scholarship, because of the closure, because of the inhumane blockade, you cannot leave. So Madiha's story actually unify the stories of the other 6 people, including my grandmother, the refugee, and at the same time reflect and communicate the collective Palestinian story at large. And this is why I thought of her to be presented as the first story in this collection. And it's amazing. I mean, I learned a lot from such women. It was really privilege. It was a really luck for me to interview her, to learn from her. So may her soul rest in peace.
Madiha's story is so remarkable because through her personal narrative, it really deconstructs and challenges so many of the stereotypes that distort external representations and perceptions of Palestine. And because we've talked about erasure, but the erasure is such that even when people think they're seeing Palestine, so much of what they're seeing are really just these stereotypes and distortions. And I think some of the most pernicious and prominent stereotypes are those about gender and Muslim women and Arab women and Arab men and Muslim men. We know in the propagation of the war on terror at large, this image of the Muslim woman as nothing but a passive victim without agency is so prevalent, and concomitant with that is the image of the violent Muslim male patriarch or terrorist who inflicts violence on women in the private sphere and on civilians in the public sphere at large. And we know that even in sometimes ostensibly progressive representations, these types of stereotypes are reproduced. For example, the focus on women and children as the primary as victims of Israel's violence in a way that both infantilizes Muslim and Arab women and also perpetuates the representation of Muslim and Arab men as inherently guilty and disposable and suspicious and militaristic. So can you talk a bit about the way that Madiha's narrative really challenges and dismantles so many of these stereotypes which are so prevalent across the political spectrum about Palestinians, about Muslims, about Arabs?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And in fact, very important question, even for me as a 3rd generation refugees or a woman in Gaza, even to hear Madiha's story and, you know, all what she have done, and also to be raised, I would say, by 2 strong women, my grandmother after passing away of my grandfather after the war of 1967, and my mother and other grandmother. And I see the strength, the resilience, the power of Palestinian women in the camp or in the city. But when I interacted with Madiha, you just feel you are really in a solid ground, because, you know, sometimes you feel, you know, the lack of representation of women and Palestinian women, Muslim women in particular, and Muslim women from Gaza. It's really, it's in fact, I would say the misrepresentation, because when I went to Britain to study for the first time in my life, 1999, 2000, and people have this image about you that it's not you, but all the time they want to tell you that, but this is, how come you end here in Britain and study and you do this and that. And in fact, I wanted, you know, just to go back, 90 years, when Madiha was born in that 1924, and how Madiha power and character and strength shows the relationship between, let's say, in the Palestinian society, in the public sphere, in the private sphere, her relation to her dad, to her husband, to the Gaza community leaders when she's pushing for, her initiative and take, this initiative to open schools for Gaza girls. So what I wanted to say that when Madiha talked about her dad at the beginning and her dream to pursue a higher education, and then her dad reluctant to send her because of, the traditions, because of the Islamic rules, she cannot travel alone by herself. And Madiha resort to this trick to the family so that her dad would allow her to go study. And all the time when she sits with him to eat, she would him, Dad, you said to me that you will think about sending me to study, to pursue higher education. He said, okay, Madiha, yes, I haven't decided. But then she would raise the question again. And this, way of communication with her dad, and especially for Madiha's dad as a scholar and at the same time religious man who has to keep his word. And in fact, when we were talking with Madiha, she was always telling him, you remember the Islamic rule that the Muslim could be anything, could do so and so, but he can't lie. You promised me, you cannot break my promise. And then even her dad, when he pushes or encourages her to read, because he has, a large library at home, and he would tell her, read in your vacation or after school, and if you have any words that you don't know, just underline them, and then I would explain to you the meaning of these words. So how Madi had persistence and, dreams and aspiration that represent any young girl in any place in the world. And this is the normal at that point of time in 1930s in one of the rural areas of the Gaza Strip, that a woman would, break the traditions and convince her dad, saying, well, that was to travel alone during when women were traveling on camels and donkey when there was no protection. But now, we are in the 20th century, we could so and so. So her dad would agree. So you see, I won't use the civilized way of conversation, because even this word is misinterpreted as there is civilized and uncivilized. But anyway, so Madiha managed to convince her that. And even if we look to her relationship with her husband, with Ibrahim, it's a complete partnership. The love, she loved him, she married him, she managed to tame her dad and lessen his restrictedness. Madiha would later be among these Gaza civil society leaders to convince them to take the initiative to deal with the situation on the ground with all these thousands of girls that need to be educated. They don't need to be in the city. We don't need to the international community or wait for the international community to solve the problem, whether politically or from the human perspective. So she was, in the front line. She was, with her ideas, with her motivation, with her, persistence. This is why when you raise this question about relationship or the Orientalist, stereotype about men and women in the Islamic world or in the East, that they are sort of a threat or sort of danger. In fact, what threatened Madiha's life were not the men, were not the culture, not the religion, but rather the violence, the systematic violence practiced by the state, by the occupation, by the apartheid, by the blockade that Madiha, passed away in 2011 amid a very difficult situation that 2 million people are still living at this moment. The danger and the threat comes from the violence of the occupation, the attacks on Gaza, the blockade, the denial of people of basic rights to education, right of return to their homes, right to have electricity. Now we have this webinar, we have power. Gaza doesn't have power, but 8 hours a day. We know why. It's because of the violence of the occupation that, making life is horrible for people. So just to summarize, I would say Madiha gave a very clear, bold, and healthy picture about the relationship in the Muslim society between men and women. Yes, true, there are restrictness, or let's say some traditions and some ways, as in every society, that would, hinder women. But women, navigate their way and make it possible. I mean, as in every society, and doing it in from inside, and in fact balancing this, not imposed on them. So I hope I answered the question. I know I'm a bit sometimes passionate about Madiha, but really it's I would say one of the luckiest opportunities or times that I have been able to meet Madiha and the other women and learn from them. And there are thousands of Madihas in Palestine, excluded, not per se as individuals, but as a collective. This, experience, this, way of resisting the odds and standing fast to continue to lead a life of dignity and of rights.
I think we see time and time in colonial projects this central conceit that they are saving women from their backwards, barbaric, uncivilized, violent cultures. And so we see how tremendous exercises of violence against women get contorted and instead represented as exercises in saving women from ripping the hijabs and veils off of Muslim women in Algeria to the present day, when we see countries being invaded and occupied in the name of saving women. And we know the two central myths that animate this conceit are the idea of the benevolence of the colonizers and the helplessness of the women who are colonized. And yet in Madiha's story, we see how, for example, she started these schools for refugees before UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, was even on the ground, and how her schools became the seed for these international projects of education. And so can you talk a bit about how Madiha's story and the story of so many other women in Palestine really challenge this idea that the colonized lack agency, that they have no politics of their own, that they're passive recipients of humanitarian aid? Because so often we think that the humanitarian representations are the opposite of the demonizing militaristic representations, but actually they just end up being two sides of the same coin, and both are premised on the denial of any legitimate political agency to the colonized.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, really Madiha story uncover lots of details about Palestinian society, about life of women, about political, social, traditional aspects. And this is what we wanted in this project, not to focus on the politics, but rather the whole entire life, the details that are not recorded. And even if it is recorded or conveyed to the world, it's misrepresented. And this is why Edward Said has written his famous article, The Permission to Narrate, because during the invasion of Lebanon, he was calling the family and telling all these bits and pieces about what is happening that a clip in TV or an article of Western journal does not cover at all. And he urges them to write such issues, but people are busy, people are under attack, and this is actually what made me during the 2000s, while navigating my role to contribute to my struggle, how could I add? I'm no more a teenager who could go to the street and throw stones. I am a mother and I have a child. And so I thought of preserving, part of this history and part of this narrative. So when I was talking to Madiha, and she revealed like how, and actually normally, like I saw this influx of refugees, I got so sad, I was crying every day when she finishes her, job as a teacher, and she saw them, asleep in the streets in 200,000. There is no homes, no places in the mosques, under the fig trees, under the palm trees. And she wanted to do something. And this is before any humanitarian, as you said, organization, I mean, a part of the Quakers at that point of time, helping Palestinian refugees. So to think, to have the initiative as a woman, one woman, and then to convince Gaza civil society leader Abdel Haq Abdel Shafi, I think, or Nahid al-Rais, to say, how would you do it? And she would explain, well, I'm gonna bring the stuff. I have students who finished, let's say, 5th or 7th class. They are in the position to teach. I could go to the refugees' families and convince them to send their daughter from age of 6 till 18. I will let my sister who finished the training school in Ramallah to be with them, so that, to give sort of a trust. I will write a leaflet. I will distribute it among refugees. If this talks about anything, it talks about the agency. It talks about how the strong Palestinian women were at that point of time, 1948, before the arrival of any assistance from the outside to lead. It talks about the relationship of the Palestinian society, how healthy the civil society, how strong the women rule, and how she would, do all this of that, an end of 1,600 students. And she was like a supervisor of a school of less than 100, and then dividing them into 2 shifts and getting from the Quakers, the tents and some, I would say, help or rewards for these volunteers who would work. So it talks about the great agency of the Palestinian women, even at that point of time, and very much contradict the stereotype that sometimes the media or the education want us to believe about Muslim women, about Palestinian women, about Gazan women. And in fact, Azeezah, this aspect, what made Barbara Bell, my partner in this project, to be, to work with me, because we met at a point that, because she lived in Gaza for 5 years, she saw how rich the community by its, I would say, solidarity, traditions, care, resilience. And she said, this negates anything I have learned about you in school, as if I am being introduced to a different people. And she said, this needs to be captured, and we do not need to reinterpret any of the words of these women. We'll just, take the story as it is, with its originality, its ordinary or normality, with its pureness, without interpretation. Because if you interpret it, then the facts could be lost in interpretation. So let the women lead the story, present a version of history that was theirs or is theirs, and at the same time reflect the history of entire nation. And to a large extent, with each woman we interviewed, because the narrative, as you readers would see later on, overlaps, and at the same time bringing a story that very much contradict with the stereotype. And as Edward Said is saying, we have been reduced to a subhuman, as in each nation fight for its liberation or freedom under colonial regime. The colonizer reduced the people, they label them in negative things, and a stereotype that has nothing to do with these people. And in order to rescue your history, yourself, your being, you have to collect this narrative, so that now when you look at yourself amid the 21st century, in this very difficult situation, bleak one, dark one, in Gaza, amid the blockade, where you come from. You're standing in a solid ground, rich history, rich relationship. In fact, this solidarity and this relationship that makes society like Gaza now last. And despite all these, I would say, theories that it would collapse because they live less than $2 a day, 1.25 cent, which is the poverty line that is talked about. It is this solidarity, it is this care that Madiha has talked about in length when she speaks about her life.
Thank you, Professor Ageel. I work closely with Rohingya communities. And in that situation as well, we see how what is often represented as an act of care towards people experiencing genocide and expulsion by constantly showing their suffering, that this actually ends up further perpetuating and entrenching their dehumanization and naturalizing their suffering and exposure to violence. And so that is why it is so important to do as you do, which is to show not only the suffering and pain, but also the great care and love and dignity and desire for liberation that persists through all of that oppression and violence. So thank you. Everyone, please send in your questions that you may have for Professor Ageel. We have several here in the Q&A box already, and so I'll just read them out to you, and you can respond to them as you like. And everyone, please continue sending in your questions. So first, Madiha was clearly an ambitious woman and achieved much despite the many obstacles that she faced. Do you feel that she was quote unquote fulfilled through her life, or did she live with a sense of regret or lost opportunity? What things gave her the greatest sense of fulfillment? And pursuant to that, do you feel that Madiha's husband enabled or threatened her self-actualization? And then there's also some questions about what has changed in Gaza since Madiha was a young Palestinian woman, and also about what women in Gaza can do to neutralize the violence, the occupational violence, the colonial violence that is disempowering them. So questions about Madiha's relationship with her husband and her sense of self-fulfillment, and then some questions about the context in Gaza, what has changed, and what women are doing to resist the violence that threatens them.
Well, thanks for the question first. And I would tell from my communication, or in fact, over 2 years or 2 years and a half, we have communicated with Madiha, and later on, of course, with her children after she passed away. I would say from what she have told us, Madiha led a life, and I would say she lived it to the fullest. I mean, she achieved all her dreams despite, as I said, the issues and the problems living under a military occupation. For example, she had 9 children. She raised them. All of them got the opportunity to be educated and to have a very good position in society to serve their community, whether in Gaza or outside Gaza. Madiha was to a large extent an independent woman. We could see it from her relationship with her dad, and maybe because her mother passed away when she was very young, so Madiha has to assume even the responsibility of being a mother at a very young age, a teenager, for her sister and her brother. So this gives also Madiha this strength and more responsibility at her end. Her dream, her intelligence, her way of negotiating, even in a traditional society, to take her rights, to marry the person that she loved, to build a life that is based on partnership. And it's very much, I would say, it's explained in the details of the story, how the decisions are taken in her family, how she pushes her husband to do so and so, and Ibrahim would listen to her advice and follow. So being later on, when she decided not to resign from her school, so that she dedicate time for her children, and then her own decision to get back in the 60s after her children grow up and they are at the university, no more needing her, I would say, extensive care or time. And then she, even at old age, I think 60, she wanted to learn to drive a car, and she passed her the driving test, and she drives the car, and she has the initiative to open a school for the disabled people and continue giving to the society back, and strengthening. So I think Madiha lived very happy life, and I think till the last minute, and I think there is a quote at the story when Ibrahim say it's, the best thing in this life is just to look at your face and look at your eyes. And I wonder why you have this such a very warm eyes, warm smile, warm heart. And I think she told him something like, it is the faith, it is the love, it is. So to a large extent, I do agree that Madiha, during the 87 years of her life, she achieved and she managed to pursue and achieve most of the things or the goals that she set for herself. As for the question, how Palestinian women in Gaza at this, how life changed after Madiha. And in fact, I wouldn't say it changed. In fact, it's the closure and the blockade become tighter. Yes, Israel has declared to the world Gaza is not occupied anymore because it's withdrew or redeployed its forces from the place. But the matter of the fact that air and land and sea is controlled by Israel, and the place now is called the largest concentration camp in the world, the largest open air prison, because people denied basic rights to travel, right of mobility, right to pursue education, right to get medication during this COVID or pandemic with limited resources, because already the health system is collapsing or collapsed because of the 15 years of blockade. And despite that, women still on their feet, pushing as I would say a life giver, as traditional keeper, as cultural bearers. They are putting the smile in the faces. They are leading life sometimes without husband because he's in jail. Thousands of Palestinians are in the Israeli jails, or their husbands are dead because they have been killed or wounded. I mean, the best manifestation of the power of women, we could see it in the Great March of Return that started March 2018 for 2 years till I think it ended because of the pandemic last year, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians every week demonstrated peacefully along the razor fence of Gaza, most of them women and young students, carrying the banners that we want our right back, right of return to our villages, ending the blockade, we want to live in dignity. So it is not what the Palestinian women are doing, it is the response of the occupier. It is the ignorance and silence of the international community towards these calls that are sent by women, by mothers, by students, by sisters, seeking or raising the attention to this inhumane situation that is going on and on. It is really, it's a shame in the 21st century when there is this technology and knowledge that no one could say we don't know that this is happening, that people are living less than $2 a day, and poverty, because it is man-made poverty. It is not a famine, or is not a natural disaster. People without electricity, people denied to move, people cannot get medication, cannot get a permission. Imagine, how the situation of women. Imagine a woman now of a child who needs medication, and the medication are not in Gaza, and denied permission to go to Israel to take medication, or denied to leave Gaza to Egypt because Egypt also closing the border. So situation of women is deteriorating because of the violence practiced of the occupation and the contractor of this occupation and the silence of international community.
I think what we see time and time again in context of oppression is that the problem isn't an absence of knowledge about the violence, but the presence of narratives to justify it. And that's why the solution to racist violence, to colonial violence, isn't simply producing more knowledge, but about producing different narratives, which is why the kind of work that's being done in this series is so important. I think we have time for one more question from the audience before we'll have to wrap up, unfortunately. And so this question is about how has the work of storytelling had to change and adapt when the context of storytelling to adapt in describing history when what is visible has changed or disappeared. So when what is being narrated lives only in memory and has been dismantled in reality.
if I understood the question right, you're or asking about what has changed or from collecting this narrative.
I suppose, how do we make vivid the types of stories about Palestine that you tell in the book when they are describing a geography, a reality, a society that's so changed now because it's been so shattered and dismantled by the occupation?
Yes, well, despite, I would say, these facts that the villages, the 560 villages have been depopulated, destroyed. What is the benefit of, let's say, of having these stories? And in fact, I would say it's very, very important, even at this imbalance of power. Rights are rights. No one can give up their rights. It's enshrined in international law, though everyone has the right to leave his country and return back to that country. Everyone has the right to live in dignity and freedom. Everyone is not like when these rights have been written, it wasn't meant that Palestinians or marginalized groups should be excluded from international law and these sorts of law. So by actually holding tight to our rights, and at the same time, the persistence and the resilience, one day Palestine would be free. I mean, there has been never a time that there has been balance between occupied and occupier, colonizer and colonized. Think of Algeria and think of South Africa. It's always policies to impose narrative, to impose history, to impose version of things that very much negate or exclude the owners of the right. What is happening in South Africa? Everyone say how the apartheid would be dismantled. It has been dismantled. Yes, not yet to the degree that everyone would enjoy equal rights, but a start has happened. And the same thing in Algeria, the same thing in all the colonized nations who got their liberation. So by preserving this history, you keep your rights alive. Maybe now, because of this situation, we're not able to carry a project of for freedom and liberation or dignity. But one day this would happen. And this is actually things sometimes people do not, I would say, not understand it, but grasp it, that they want you to feel that you're defeated. You are powerless, you cannot do anything. And this sort of narrative could be, if you look really at the statistics, at Goldstone report, at poverty line, at lots of these reports and statistics. But the fact, or the matter of the fact, that Gaza, that place that they are saying that it's going to be uninhabitable by 2020, and people are going to get mad or irrational, or because of the situation, they're getting stronger because they have the belief, they have the right, they have the faith that the way to freedom is long, and you have to sacrifice. And at the same time, rights have never been given. Rights are taken by this resilience, taken by opening a conversation like that, kept by, giving a space and a time and room to these stories to be shared, and these rights to be, talked about. And at the end of the day, Palestinians are sure that they would one day return to their homes and their land and live peacefully with their neighbors, whoever their neighbors are, because that was the situation in Palestine before since the beginning of the 20th century, before Britain colonized Palestine. There has the Palestinian Jew, the Palestinian Christian, the Palestinian Muslim, all live in harmony. There is a place for everyone. So, but in order for peace to be achieved, we have to think about equality, dismantling apartheid, give people rights back, and then peace would come to everyone, including Palestinians, Israelis, Muslims or non-Muslim, Jews and Christians. This is nothing about religion. It's about rights, political rights. It's about existence. It's about dignity. It's about freedom. And it's about the faith. And when I visit Gaza every year, when I talk to the people there or in West Bank, they are determined more than ever, the fourth generation, the fifth generation of refugees, that they have a right. And one day they will return to that place, that called home, and inshallah, live peacefully and happily with their neighbors, inshallah.
Inshallah. You mentioned the example of apartheid in South Africa, and history tells us how countries like Canada for so long supported the apartheid regime, but after the fall of apartheid, now our history has been revised as if Canada was against apartheid all along. And so inshallah, one day, the day will come when Palestine is also liberated and no one will ever want to admit that they were supporters of Israel's colonial project against the Palestinians. To bring us to a day when that future is arrived, maybe we can finish with one last question from the audience. If you can share with us some initiatives being led by women from Gaza that the international community, including us here, can support.
Well, there are many initiatives. In fact, at the moment, I am involved with a group in my camp to, I would say to, because you know, water, drinkable water is not, well, you have a right to have a clean water to drink, but unfortunately, I think 97 to 99% of Gaza water are not drinkable. And then this is again very much related to the occupation. So people rely on desalinated water to be, you know, sold and distributed. And many of the families, because of the blockade, cannot afford to buy drinkable water. You talk about what, 15 liters a day, when the human being need, well, at least 10 or 17 liters a day. So we got this initiative with women in the camp as well as young men in the camp, so that we could collect some donation, so that we could secure clean and drinkable water to reach the people who cannot afford buying those waters. So it's not like an organization per se to say, but it's just an initiative that I am helping with by spreading the word, raise some donations so that we could secure to hundreds of families and their children this water. But there are many women organizations one could fund, I mean, or help with. I mean, UNRWA, for example, the Gaza Mental Health Program, the Gaza Human Rights. There are, yes, they are not per se women projects, but they are making sure that the assistance are received by Palestinian families. But that was what I talked about is this initiative of securing drinkable water for poor families through, you know, providing a small amount of money, which is like around $10 a month, that could give clean water for a family for a month.
And as the indigenous land and water protectors at Standing Rock remind us against the Dakota Access Pipeline, water is life. And so I think that's such a beautiful initiative that you've shared with us. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, our time for this conversation tonight has come to an end. We wanted to finish by sharing a poem written by Madiha. It's short, and so we just wanted to finish by bringing her words with us into this virtual space tonight. It's called A Bird and Other Birds. You are lucky birds flying from tree to tree, rose to rose. You are happy birds singing and dancing. I can't understand your songs, and I can't understand your laugh, because I am imprisoned here. Please come and see my tears, my situation, my life. It's an awful life. I wish to be like you, but I can't. And so with those words of Madiha's, we'll turn it back to you, Michael. Thank you everyone for listening tonight and participating.
Thank you so much. I'd like to extend my greatest thank you to Dr. Ageel for sharing with us your time and expertise. Thank you, Azeezah Kanji, for leading a fascinating discussion. Thank you to everyone who participated. There's lots of comments on the webinar and on Facebook expressing thank you to Dr. Ageel. So people watching across the country very moved by this discussion tonight. I'd like to thank Kathy Crooks of the University of Alberta Press again for help in organizing this event to make it a success. Again, if you missed it earlier, if you want a copy of this amazing book, Kathy has put the details into the chat for how you can get a copy for 20% off. So definitely take them up on this offer. I'll also just say that events like this one take time and resources to put into motion. So if you're interested in making a donation to CJPME to help cover the costs of this event, it would be greatly appreciated. Just go to our website at cjpme.org, click on the donate button in the upper right, and then you'll also find information about our campaigns and resources on our website, many of them related directly to Gaza. So we invite you to go and take a look. Thanks again for everyone who participated, for your questions. We look forward to having you at future webinar events. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a good night.
Thank you.